successful example. Now, outmoded, dated it may be, but one very successful example of how to reach at least his generation. And when I say liberalism, I trust you don't, I'm not speaking of classical liberalism, Adam Smith or John Locke. I'm not thinking of political liberalism or any political party as we would understand it today, but liberalism. And it's not a swear word that we just slap up on, I don't like your theology, I'll call it liberalism. It is actually, there is a tradition of American liberal theology with its own coherent set of ideas and doctrine. Perhaps the preeminent scholar today of liberalism is a man named Gary Dorian. He's a professor at Union Theological Seminary, which is Fosdick's alma mater. I have his 3 volumes on the history of American liberal theology. He says this. So here's someone who is a part of the liberal tradition. So I'm not cherry-picking an example, trying to be fair. He says, the idea of liberal theology is the 300-year-old idea, quote, that Christian theology can be genuinely Christian without being based upon external authority. This is one sentence. Now notice he says it's 300 years old, so he acknowledges this is modern. This is not the religion that goes back to the Reformers or to the medieval or the Church Fathers. 300-year-old idea. Liberalism is the belief, quote, that religion should be modern and progressive from the standpoint of modern knowledge and experience. Dorian argues that those are the 2 key factors to define liberal theology, that liberal theology finds its coherence and its measure of truthfulness based on human reason and human experience. That's what he means when he says not based on external authority. Now, it's not that a liberal is going to say, I don't care about the Bible. Fosdick understood, at least he knew the Bible. Nobody says, I just absolutely don't believe the Bible. But it is the Bible that must finally submit itself to human reason and human experience. It is the conviction, Dorian says, that you can be a faithful Christian without believing in hell or Noah's flood or believing that God commanded the extermination of the Canaanites or that God demanded the literal sacrifice of his son as a substitutionary legal payment for sin. Now, in all of this, Fosdick really was the most eloquent spokesman of his age. Part of what made him so eloquent is he thought of himself as an evangelical. Now, that term becomes very elastic, and I suppose in one very remote sense, you could say he's an evangelical liberal in that he preached sermons from the Bible, not well according to our standards. He wanted people to have a personal relationship with Jesus. He wanted to see Jesus make a difference in the world and in people's lives. But Fosdick departed from almost all of the core tenets of historic Christian faith. When he preached about salvation from sin, there was no clear doctrine of atonement, no mention of divine wrath. He only said, quote, Jesus came to save men from that inner wrongness that curses human life. He did not believe in the divinity of Christ. Quote, wherever goodness, beauty, truth, love are, there is the divine. He said Jesus is divine if we look at the divinity of his spiritual life. But Jesus was divine in a way that differs in degree, not kind, from the way that we can be divine. It was the divinity of an elevated, inspirational spiritual life. He explicitly rejected the creed of Chalcedon, 451. It's a classic definition of the 2 natures, 1 person of the Son. He denied all of that. He argued that the historic church, quote, had garbled Jesus beyond all recognition. So when Fosdick says, I'm a heretic, we ought to take him at his word. Almost done here with Fosdick. According to his biographer, he says Fosdick's ministry can be summed up with this single line. Here it is. Though astronomies change, the stars abide. That was the essence of his liberal theology. Sometimes it's talked about the kernel and the husk. The kernel there remains the same, but the husk, the wrapping, changes. So here, astronomies change, meaning our theology are simply human reflections on unchangeable divine realities, but our formulas, our creeds, our confessions, the doctrines that we fight over, he said those things change from age to age, and in fact they must change according to this modern age, but the stars remain. One of his sermons toward the end of his life was from Joshua 7:6, where Joshua falls on his face before the ark. And Fosdick says, the ark passes away, but religion remains. And then he takes that passage and he argues that we all have our ark. It's almost like we all have our own Goliaths. Our own ark, he says, for some is a special doctrine, a specific denomination, some ritual. He says maybe belief in creation by divine fiat, or maybe a belief in the virgin birth. He says that's the ark. Quote, such things may have been very precious in your experience, but we must not confuse keeping religion with keeping the ark. He says Christians are separated by creeds and rituals. We find common ground in our prayers and hymns. Here's what he says, the essence of 20th century liberal Christianity. Quote, if then you ask what true liberalism is, I should say that it is one that pays little attention to the ark that divides, but cares with all its heart about the religion that unites. So astronomies change, the stars abide. That was the essence of his liberal faith. Now, I don't think we have to imagine too hard to find that this same impulse exists in many places. The liberalism, as it was entrenched in mainline denominations, has been completely gutted. The attendance rates, membership rates of all these mainline denominations have been falling, plummeting for the last 60 years, and yet that spirit isn't very hard to probably find on your Twitter feed or a conference or a book or a Facebook feed, that we should not pay attention to these arcs that divide, but with all of our heart attend to the religion underneath that unites. The most articulate and resolute opponent of Fosdick and of liberalism is the man that we want to talk about now in the second half of this morning's class. J. Gresham, that's how it's pronounced, J. Gresham Machen, New Testament scholar at, by his creation, Westminster Seminary, and before that, Princeton Seminary.